Ian, normally I invite the people who are speaking to introduce themselves and just say why they're talking about what they're talking, and then go straight on in.
Okay,
So
right.
it's all yours,
Oh,
sir.
yeah, right. I'm Ian Graham. Why am I here? Because I'm run men in sheds on the Isle of Wight. And as you probably know, Graham is also on the Isle of Wight, and he's a member of the group there. And we take turn about over a sort of long period of chatting about things. And I pulled together something on electric cars. And afterwards, Graham said, "Oh, yes, I've got this group that meets on a Wednesday once a month. Would you mind giving that presentation to them?" So using my technical skills in IT, I spent my whole life working in IT. I managed to delete the whole presentation without saving it. So I had to start again. So Graham hasn't seen this presentation before, although he may have told you that he has. Uh, so that's me. Let's get straight on with it. So why even think about an electric car? Well, in my opinion, probably climate is the biggest example, and also pollution. On the climate, uh, you read in the press all these things about climate change, etc. But I think one of the more interesting ones was the Sphinx snow patch. I don't know if any of you have heard about that. But up in Scotland, there's a little patch of snow that people noticed had never disappeared over the summer. And it needs a certain amount of snowfall, and obviously summer temperatures drive how small it got. In 200 years of recording this, it never fully melted until 1933, and that was reported in the Times that it had melted completely. It then vanished again in 1959, 96, 2003, 2006, 2017, 18, 20, 21, 22, 23, and 24. Now, I don't think I need to graph that out to show you that over the last few years, the number of times it's disappeared has been, well, every single year for the past 5 years. Whereas back 200 years ago up to sort of 100 years ago, it hadn't gone at all. So that's one of the reasons. We have climate change, so I'm hoping that by driving an electric car, I'm helping to reduce that in a very small way. The other thing is pollution. I don't know what age the general audience is here, but some of you will remember back in the 50s, burning coal resulted in a huge amount of pollution, especially smog in London and so on. And that resulted in the Clean Air Act. But with carbon dioxide and nitrogen oxide, pollution is sort of invisible. So we seem to largely ignore it, which is a bit strange to me. The next thing is in terms of pollution, the world's resources haven't really been considered for about 100 years of conventional motoring and producing cars, digging mines, knocking down mountains, whatever. Now suddenly it's incredibly important. So all the press is full of all these things about lithium. There's this absolute paranoia about how much lithium there is. I started before I'd actually started working, I spent 2 years in Canada, in Manitoba, and went up to the north of Manitoba on a exploratory trip and went down a mine there. Now, at that time, there were 15 mines in northern Manitoba, and spoke to the people there. It was a very fascinating trip, and most of them were looking for nickel. So these 15 mines were mining nickel, but they also got other things, copper, tin, zinc, out as well. And they said, well, what's all this nickel for? It was almost entirely going to the US car industry to produce chrome bumpers, chrome headlights, all these flashy things that people had in cars in the 60s and 70s and so on. I read in the paper 2 or 3 months ago, the last mine in northern Manitoba is about to shut. They've exhausted all the nickel. Now, you don't ever hear about these things, but suddenly, as I say, with lithium, there's an enormous fuss about it. So, something to think about. The other thing is petrol, diesel, and non-plug-in hybrid cars are not zero emissions. only fully electric ones are at the point of use. And terminology that the car manufacturers have come out with to talk about the different types is quite annoying, like mild hybrids and things like that. I believe it's in the car maker's interest to sell hybrids and then to sell the electric. They effectively get 2 sales over a period rather than 1. If you're thinking about going away from conventional cars, though, what about hydrogen? Well, hydrogen's quite unsafe if it explodes, obviously. And although there are some experiments going on there, it is so far behind what's happened in electric cars that the investment necessary to get a large number of people driving hydrogen vehicles, I think is extremely unlikely to happen. There might be niche markets there, but not for the mass market. And what about public transport? Well, my whole lifetime, they've had various efforts to get people to use more public transport. Some have been more successful than others. But the reality is the convenience of having your own ability to go where and when you want is just too attractive for people. So I can't see that cars are going to disappear instead of moving ahead with them. So let's look, you'll probably all be familiar with this. There's lots of different types, as I said, but basically let's split them into 4. So you've got conventional cars, so you know, that's your diesel and your petrol ones. They consume the most fuel, obviously. They have significant emissions, and there's a 1,000,001 examples. Hybrids, slightly less fuel. It depends, obviously, on where you go and, you know, how far you go and how often you use it, etc., etc. But they include batteries now as well as having fuel. So potentially, you could probably have, with the right type of hybrid, 0 emissions. If say you had a range of 50 miles and you never did more than 50 miles before recharging. You get plug-in hybrids. So a hybrid that is a plug-in hybrid is far better than one that runs straight off the engine. So if you're just burning petrol all the time to charge a battery to run the car, that to me seems almost crazy, but there are an awful lot of examples of these around. Whereas a plug-in hybrid, you've got the chance of actually running without consuming fuel. And then you have the all-electric vehicles. Probably the Nissan Leaf and Tesla models are the most obvious examples of these. So only fully electric ones are truly 0 emission. And in terms of what's the difference between them? So I've got an electric vehicle. Maybe I should have said up front, I've got a Kona. And I bought that for a reason. It was the first electric car that I had seen that was in a reasonable price bracket that gave a range of over 300 miles. So up till that point, I'd seen other electric cars. I knew people that had electric cars that I think the original Nissan Leaf was about 100, 120 miles. To me, that seemed just far, far too low, given the type of driving that I expected to do. But with the Kona over 300 miles, that then seemed a point where it was worth looking at an electric car. How different are they? Well, I think the first thing you realize is they're all very much the same as any other car. The body's the same, the seats, the wheels, the tires, the suspension, the electronics. And if we just, well, we'll come on to an actual picture of inside the bonnet in a moment. But there's an amazing number of components that are the same between all these different variants, for the obvious reason that the manufacturers want to reduce their costs. So if we look at where we are with moving towards electric vehicles, I just, shortly before the presentation, in fact, I was looking up the SMMT new car figures for September and for the year to date, and comparing that with the previous year. So you can see in September that diesel and petrol, slight declines. Battery electric vehicles, which is the next group, have gone up 24.4%. change. So that's good. And then plug-in hybrids have actually gone up more, so 32%, which to me indicates there's a big push towards these as opposed to pure electric vehicles. And HEV are hybrids, so there's a slight increase in them. Okay. So straight away before, okay, that's the sort of background, if you like. Would I recommend somebody get an electric car? Well, there's three things in my mind that if these apply to you, forget about it. If it's too expensive, that is, you can't afford it, well, forget about it. Just like anything else in life, if you can't afford it, don't do it. The second reason is if you intend towing a caravan. And why do I say that? Because pure battery electric vehicles just don't have the towing power. They use up far too much of the battery if you're towing a big weight. So things may change in the future, I don't know, but that would be my recommendation at the moment. And the third one, maybe a bit more controversially, is if you can't get an off-road charger at your house. I've seen articles written by people who have jumped into getting electric cars, couldn't charge them at home, charged on the public infrastructure or ran a cable out over the pavement, which I think is not a very good idea, and decided to give up on electric vehicles. Because if you're going to rely on the public charging infrastructure, there's a big cost associated with that. I'll come back to that in a minute. So the other things to think about, apart from these no-nos, is first of all, if you want to be able to charge at home and can charge at home, you're going to have to spend about 700 to 1500, depends on the make and the model and who installs it and whether the car manufacturer gives you a discount or a contribution, I should say, towards the cost. But you need a home charger. There's various different types. They can be tethered and untethered. They can be locking and non-locking. They can be single use or available to others. So if you want your charger to be secure, you'll want a locking one. It's a convenience thing whether you have it tethered or untethered. In case you don't know what the term means, if it's tethered, it means there's already a cable on it and you just plug that into the car. Untethered means there's no cable there. You take the cable out of your car, plug it into the car, and then plug it into the home charger. The rates of charge are important. If you plug into a normal 3-pin socket, you'll get about 3 kilowatts of charge going into the car. That means in, say, a 60 kilowatt car, that's a long time to charge up at 3 kilowatt hours. By putting in a home charger, you'll get about 7. I say about 7, it obviously depends on other things that are going on and how much else you're using in the house, etc. But here at home, if I'm not using anything, no dishwashers or anything on, and the car's charging, it will actually charge at about 7.4. And then you get fast chargers, which tend to be the ones that are on the public network, and they can be AC or DC. And some of the DC ones, I think, are getting up to about 300 kilowatt charging. But the charge rate depends on the car model. So if you're looking and you see that motorway service area X, it's got a 300 kilowatt charger, and you had a battery of 50 kilowatts, you can't just do a simple division, because if your car model will only accept 50 kilowatts, having a 300 kilowatt charger isn't going to help you. It'll only charge at 50 kilowatts. Okay. The next thing to think about is planning ahead. So if you drive a conventional car and what you do is you fill it up as rarely as possible, drain it right down to the lights flashing to saying you're about to go out of fuel, and then you nip into a garage, I think you'll find that electric cars are not for you. I don't think you can really do that. You need to think ahead of how far am I going? Where am I likely to be able to charge up? So, for example, I went to a wedding down in Devon in the summer, and I looked at where all the chargers were. It's quite easy to get apps that show you where all the chargers are these days, and worked out the rough mileage. So I thought the best strategy was to get down to near where I was going on the very first day and charge up straight away. That would then fill up the battery enough for me to do some local mileage while I was down there and get home again without having to worry about things. So that's what I did. And I went to a charging place in Combe Martin. And if you know Combe Martin, and it was a small car park. There was 2 chargers in it. And I drove in, and there was one in use and the other one wasn't in use. So I drove straight up, plugged in the car, thought, well, it's going to take about an hour at the charge rate it was giving. So I'm going to have a walk. So I went off with my wife and had a walk, came back about, 45 minutes later, and there was a large truck in the middle of the car park, which I didn't realize was electric at first. And the guy was going around talking to everybody, asking them questions, and he was looking across at the electric charging points, both of which were in use, myself and another car. And he then found a parking space, the last one, and reversed into that. And so I thought, I'll go across and ask him what he's waiting on. And I went across and he said, oh yes, I'm waiting on a charging thing. And I said, oh, well, I'm actually on that one there. But the thing is, I've had to buy a ticket to park. So I want to be able to park. So I don't want to come off the charger until I can find a place to park. And he said, well, that's no problem. I'll block the whole car park entrance with my truck, which he then did, and let me come off the charger and reverse into his space. And then he drove onto the charger. So everybody was happy. So people that drive electric cars are sociable and get on well together. Anyway, moving on. So you need to plan ahead. The costs of charging at home, home, there's solar panels, etc., that come into all of this. I also have solar panels, just to let you know. So the cost of home electricity. So if you're charging at home and you just charge during the day, I think the rate at the moment is about 25p a kilowatt hour. Now, my son-in-law is on a tariff with Octopus Energy. And if he sets it up to charge between 11:30 in the evening and 5:30 in the morning, he gets charged 7p a kilowatt. So that's a massive, massive reduction. So that's a potential. Public rates vary from free, which is very rare now. There used to be quite a few. I think some of the Tesco supermarkets you can still charge for free, but they're only charging at 3 or 7 kilowatts. So if you're shopping for an hour, you don't get a huge amount of electricity out of them. But on motorways, etc., from the big suppliers, you're probably talking about 90p a kilowatt. Now at that price, that is as expensive per mile, in my estimation, as driving a petrol car. The charge rates on particularly motorway service areas are just ridiculous. But anyway, that's what they are. So if you're doing continuous motorway driving and you're not getting it on expenses, that would be a factor to take into account. Okay, so let's move on from that and let's have a look under the bonnet. So under the bonnet, it looks remarkably similar to a conventional car. That's the electric engine in the middle there underneath, but you can see things like the washer bottle, brake fluid reservoir, suspension units, etc. And perhaps most surprisingly, a 12-volt battery. So thinking about the major components you have, in a conventional car, you've got 12-volt electrics that run all your radio and your heating system and fan and all this sort of stuff in the car, electric windows, da-da-da. You've got an engine, a gearbox, an exhaust, and a petrol tank. So these are the major things. If you've got a pure electric vehicle, you've still got all these conventional electrics, and they're all 12 volts. Well, why? Why don't they run off the big batteries? Well, for 2 reasons. History, I suppose. The technology is well known, and it reduces cost. You've got exactly the same components as every other car. And the obvious other reason is that sticking to 12 volts is safer. You can't be zapped with a full battery, so 200 volts from the main batteries when you're opening your door or switching on your lights or whatever, because it's still running on 12 volts. So in the pure, you've got the conventional electrics, but you then, on top of that, you have an electric motor and a battery. Now, hybrids, as was said before, in terms of fuel consumption or whatever, some hybrids, the plug-in ones, you could effectively run as being zero emissions, depending on your combination of driving. But the key point to me is hybrids have a combination of all of these above things. So you not only have the conventional electrics, an engine, gearbox, exhaust and petrol tank, but you've got the electric motor and a large battery as well. So think about, as these vehicles age, the cost of the maintenance of all these components. And my personal opinion is I think the motor industry, and if you saw the SMMT figures, are pushing hybrids as a good starting point for going electric, because they know that in the medium term, these cars are going to start breaking down for all sorts of new reasons where they can take money from you to fix them or to replace parts on them. Okay. So is the transition working in terms of getting to fully electric? I mean, we've had various announcements from the government about targets to go. I don't think it is at the moment. We're getting discounts on some electric cars, and it might improve in the next year or so, because there's meant to be 22% of new cars need to be fully electric this year, and they're going to have to start paying penalties. So the prices are going to change. The budget that's going on at the moment may well change things. The manufacturers would like to see VAT come down in public charging. Even if that comes down, it's still going to be very expensive to use public charging compared with charging at home. So, as I say, garages and manufacturers are pushing hybrids. So one of the things I do to show just how sad I am is I collect a lot of data, and I have done for years and years and years against conventional cars. So when I got an electric one, I had to modify my spreadsheet and collect slightly different data. So this is part of the spreadsheet. I can show you the whole thing if you want. But the first column is just a sequence, so that's just a number. Recorded mileage in the car, how much charge was added in kilowatt hours, the price of electricity, based on where I charged, whether it was at home or whatever, or if it was public charging infrastructure, and later figures when I started using solar panels, that comes down to zero. We've got the miles driven is calculated, total cost therefore, the pence per mile. I do a moving average of the pence per mile because I found that when you graph that, it looks a bit more sensible. It doesn't bounce up and down quite so much. The date I did the charge, where it was. So you see on that first sheet, there's what, 26 recharging events. Only one of these was on the public charging infrastructure. That's Instravolt Bridport down at line 23. Where the electricity cost was 75p per kilowatt hour. So as you can see, that was a double of what the price of electricity at home was at that time. It's now, as I say, gone down to about 25p at home, so it's even more of a difference. The expected range is, once you've charged the car tells you as soon as you start it up what the expected range is. You obviously need to be able to see that, and I think a lot of conventional cars these days have that as well. And at first I didn't bother to record that, which is why a lot of that column there is empty. But then I thought, well, it's really worthwhile recording that. So I started to put that down. And you also see that I normally charge to begin with right up to 100%, because although I'd read stuff that said you should really only charge up to 80 or 90%, I thought, well, what's the point? It's plugged in, I may as well let it run up to 100%. Well, I think that the real reason for that is, and I'm not a physicist, so my understanding is if you take a car that's say got, let's say 100 kilowatt battery because the numbers are easy, and you charged up to 90 kilowatts, then you would add a kilowatt of energy and it would go up by 1. But as you get nearer to the 100, for that last 10 kilowatts to top it up, it takes more than 10 kilowatts of electricity to get the battery up that final last 10. And that's why they recommend that you don't put it right to the top. So I have changed that behavior, and now I actually only charge up to 90%. And that hasn't really had a huge difference on anything else that I do. So what's the real world range? So I've got the Conan. As I said, I bought it because I think it said at the time 304 miles was the range you could expect. The actual varies from about 250 to 350. So the highest figure I've got, if you look at the figures on the screen at the moment, the very last one there is 365. That's the highest number I've ever got when I've charged the car up to 100%. And why is there such a range? Well, the main things that impact the range is how much of the conventional electrics you're using, and also what the temperature is. So in the summer, you get much higher range from the car because you're not using the window wipers and the lights and the air conditioning, etc., and the battery's warm. In the middle of winter, when the temperature's set down at 0, you've got all the lights on, the window wipers going, it's raining, and therefore the tires have to push the water aside as you're driving along. The anticipated range is much, much less. Okay. So this is just taking the figures that I've already shown you across the whole spreadsheet and showing you that estimated range. So between September and May, I didn't record any numbers, which is why they're not there. So it starts in sort of June, and you can see how it varies through the year. So January sort of to April is much lower, and then it rises up again, and you can see it starts to dip again as we're getting towards autumn now. Okay, here's the running cost. So that's just, again, taking what you saw on that spreadsheet, but across the whole spreadsheet that I've got. And 25p for home charging. Solar's taken at 0. So the other change that I had this summer, where these numbers go right down to 0 for a period, was I thought, well, I've got solar panels and I can actually set that up to supply the car so that the car will, when you plug it in and put it on charge, the charger will only take power from the solar panels. Now that means it's much slower. It's more like a conventional 3-pin socket. You only get about 3 kilowatts coming off the solar panels, but you can do it over multiple days. So if you get days when you're not using the car very much and plug it in, you effectively get free charging. And that can make a massive difference to the overall cost of running. As you can see, it drops down. So the first year over the summer, I was using it plugging in, so it was coming out about 7p a mile running cost. But this summer, it was nothing. Now you've got the cost of the solar panels, etc. People are bound to point that out. Yes, you need an investment before you're going to be able to achieve that sort of thing. But it's not something you can achieve in a conventional car. In the case of public charging, that's where it really jumps up. So the point where it jumps up is where I've used public charging in all 3 cases. So in 2 years, I've used the public charging infrastructure 3 times. Yeah. They were all InstaVolt. Why did I use InstaVolt? Because some of the companies that are selling electricity to you for charging cars have all sorts of barriers to doing it. You need a card, you need a special, you need to pre-registered and logged on and all this sort of stuff. What I found was that InstaVolt, you just literally touch the screen with your credit card. It says, okay, plug in the car. You plug it in, you go away, that's it. Nobody, by the way, can pull the plug out while it's in. You come back again, tap your credit card on the screen. It gives you how much electricity is going in, what the cost is, da 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 da. You pull the plug out, and that's it. You drive away. So it couldn't be easier. Yes, it takes time to do that. Yes, as I said, in Coombe Martin, I had to spend an hour, but it seemed very, very easy. Which brings in the thing about conventional garages. Over our lifetimes, I would think, unless you're too young, you'll have realized that conventional garages have declined in numbers. As electric car use increases, that will continue. So people will have to drive further and further to get a conventional car topped up in a way. Garages are not going to stay because of electric car charging, because a lot of them don't provide it. There's an awful lot of garages around where they have no electric charging capability at all. And the three cases where I've used it, one was a car park, as I said. One was beside a shopping centre near a station, so it was just a car park. And the third one was at Bridport in Dorset, and that was at a sort of, what do you call it, exercise centre. So again, nothing to do with garages. So long-term garages are going to disappear quite quickly and make it difficult for people with conventional cars to get fuel. So will I keep an electric car? Would I recommend one? Well, I've had one problem with the Kona. I actually broke down, had to get the AA out. And what was it? It was the 12-volt battery failed, which I find quite ironic that that's what went wrong. So not the main battery, not any of the other components, not the wheels, tires, or anything else, but the 12-volt battery. And apparently, Tesla have now changed the conventional 12, even Teslas have 12-volt batteries in them for the electrics, the same as every other manufacturer. And they've now developed a much longer lasting 12-volt battery because they've found that's happened on Teslas as well, where the batteries failed and people can't understand why is the battery, I thought I had an electric car and it's fully charged and I can't start it because, well, there's nothing wrong with your batteries. It's actually the old 12-volt thing that doesn't work. Anyway, so I've scrapped, sold, given away, or whatever, all other petrol devices that I had. So I'm in this for the long term. I'm not going to turn back. So the petrol lawnmower, the petrol strimmer, etc., have all gone. Would I recommend that you jump in now? Well, first of all, you need to see what happens in the budget today. But I think in the next year or so, the prices are likely to drop quite a bit, both in terms of used cars, but also in terms of hitting targets. As long as these aren't changed by the government, the manufacturers will have to hit sales targets, and therefore they'll be really pushing electric cars. So, subject to the caveats at the beginning, if you can't afford it, etc., and you want to tow a caravan or whatever, then I would recommend it's worthwhile, but not just yet. And the final thing is never keep an EV for more than 8 years. My nephew did a PhD in electronics at Cambridge, and then he worked for Jaguar on their E-Pace when it was being developed. And they did a lot of testing on batteries and things. And it was him that said to me, they'll last 8 to 10 years, no more. So never touch a current electric car. That may change in the future, but don't touch a current electric car that's going to be 80 years old or over when you're using it. So if you bought a second-hand one that was 2 years old and sold it when it was 6 years old, fine. But don't buy one that's 7 years old because you're not going to have it running for too much longer if you're not careful. Okay, so that's pretty much it. I'm open to any questions if anybody has any questions.
Ian, that was very different from what I was expecting based on your previous presentation. I thought this was marvelous, and I thought the previous one was pretty good. So thank you so much for taking the time to recreate it. It's obviously greatly improved and a lot of fun. So thank you. Lots to think about there. A couple of thoughts that I'd like to throw at people before we go on to everybody else's questions. And one was that you mentioned a possible use of hydrogen for car use.
Yeah.
I've read all sorts of reports that say that in order to get climate change under control, hydrogen needs to be reserved for those really heat intensive operations where it can replace electricity and nothing else can that isn't carbon fuel. So hydrogen, I think, is the experts are suggesting that there's only so much we can make each year, and it's all needed for the big intensive operations. So let's keep your cars electric.
Yeah.
And the second thing I thought was fun was that you mentioned charging your car battery now to 90%.
Mm.
Does it tell itself when to stop, or do you have to go out there in the middle of the night and turn it off?
Oh no, it's all
It's all
automatic.
built in. Okay, that's good.
You can schedule a start time. So if you went on the cheaper electricity option, then it won't start charging until 11:30 at night. And if it reached 90% before 5:30 in the morning, because you'd have it automatically set to stop at 5:30 in the morning, but it reached 90% before that, then it would just stop.
Oh, that's great.
So
Okay. And then the last comment I had was that on your forecast of prices dropping, I thought I'd throw in that the Chinese cars coming over at the moment are so much less expensive that really giving up the local manufacturers an intensive push to reduce their prices to compete
yeah,
because the Chinese are doing such a wonderful job of reducing prices, which of course generates all sorts of other thoughts, but at least from the consumer point of view, you're right, big reduction in car prices. Let me first of all highlight the wonderful thoughts going into the chat. There's lots of useful links there from Cara in particular. So thank you very much for those. And in the meantime, let's push on and ask Stuart if you'd like to go ahead with your question, please.
Hi, thank you, and thank you, Ian, for a very interesting talk. I've actually got loads of questions. As I said earlier, I'm seriously considering buying an electric vehicle,
yeah,
so I'm in the market for them. I would heed your advice and maybe wait till next year. I was thinking about getting a second-hand one. I was having a look at some 2-year-old Polestars. They look quite nice.
yeah.
But I was wondering, do you know of anything on the horizon which is going to change electric cars? I'm thinking of different battery technologies. I gather Tesla's going to go lithium free from next year. I keep hearing about aluminium air batteries that will do 1,000-mile range, and you can just swap them out.
Mhm.
Is there anything like that on the horizon?
I think there's loads of research going on in these areas. So I can't tell the future any more than you can. So, anything could happen. But to me, you need to also think that if something radical is going to come along, there's a huge amount of investment already and is continuing to go into electric vehicles. And that creates a barrier to rapid change because they want their money back in what they've invested. So, yes, I'm sure things will change, but whether they'll change really quickly, I doubt.
Okay. And just to go back to Graham's point, I gather there's been a huge increase in the amount of naturally occurring hydrogen being found. And quite a few of the big oil exploration companies are out searching for naturally occurring hydrogen.
Well, I don't know if Graham wants to comment on that. I mean, if perhaps that's also going to be kept for sort of more industrial use rather than anything else. I mean, if you really got large amounts that was like natural gas, then I would have thought the obvious thing to do rather than people driving around with hydrogen behind seat of the car is to do it into district heating. So you're providing heating for housing, because obviously the other big consumer of fossil fuels is all our boilers in our houses. So going purely electric isn't really possible in a house. I've got solar panels. So in the summer, if I'm charging up the car, for example, I'm not supplying the house. And when the sun doesn't shine, like in the winter, you're neither charging up the car, nor are you able to provide enough from the solar panels to run your whole house. So you still need a boiler. And it'd be lovely to get rid of a boiler. I mean, okay, there's or ground source heat pumps, but I haven't yet seen that these are good enough for me to make that jump.
Can I interject? Sorry, I can't
Yeah.
be quiet in this conversation because hydrogen really winds me up. So I think the point is that we can all go to electric, but obviously we can't rely on little solar panels on our roofs to do all the energy demand that we require for our cars and our heat pumps.
Yeah.
And so that's why onshore wind is going to be a huge change to enable that, because it's a much more efficient way of generating power. And generally, when you look at when wind is at its peak, it's when solar is slightly lower, and so it balances itself pretty good in order to do that, as well as potentially adding in things like tidal, which is a guaranteed twice a day, particularly if you're in the southwest, for the second highest tide in the world. It would be great to tap into those resources, in which case we could more than generate enough energy that we require. Hydrogen is an energy transfer. It is not an energy generation. So basically you use a lot of electricity to split water molecules to break out the hydrogen, to then be able to use it. And it's a very energy intensive process, unless, as the fossil fuel companies are doing, are cracking fossil fuels in order to extract the hydrogen out of that. And that's why they're so interested in it, because it will keep them and their business going. So hydrogen is not great. I can understand for high industrial requirements, when they need a lot of heat, as has been mentioned, where we've got a lot of surplus renewables, then hydrogen does make some sort of sense, but certainly not for putting it into households, because also to note, the hydrogen molecule is super small, and our existing infrastructure is not designed to be able to contain hydrogen molecules, nor can it actually contain fossil fuel gas, because we've got a huge amount of lost in the network of gas through leakage. And once hydrogen gets into the atmosphere and bonds with other types of gas, it actually becomes quite negative for climate change impacts. So hydrogen, no. In terms of some of the stuff you're talking about electric vehicles, and it's so great to hear your passion to share with others your experience. You're right, there are a lot of things happening in the battery technology area, and I have put in the chat a link to Fully Charge, which is an online, they have loads of videos and information about all sorts of things around electric vehicles, what's coming up in new technology, but also a lot of reviews about existing electric vehicles alongside renewable energy as well. So that will be reiterated, no doubt, in their stuff about hydrogen. So I recommend that. And in terms of being able to tow, EVs can tow, and certainly more of the current ones are very capable. They've got a huge amount of torque, so towing is actually not a problem. But as you note, if you're going long distances and uphills is a very heavy thing, so it will impact your battery range. So that is something to be mindful of. And there are quite a number of really interesting and useful websites looking at all the networks across the country, so providing public charging. I agree that having a home charger is better because it's cheaper, and as you say, if you've got a PV, then you can generate free energy to put into your car and run on sunshine. But as you also noted, there are more public EV charging points now across the country than there are fossil fuel gas stations. And you can also convert. So there's quite a lot of work going around supporting to create low cost, particularly sometimes reusing some of the batteries from particularly crashed EVs. So there's been more kind of superficial damage to a vehicle and it hasn't caused any issues to the battery. And people are picking that up for a few £1,000s to help do conversion kits for existing cars. So that's also another opportunity to get a kind of lower cost one. And in terms of length of time, interesting about the 80% or 90% charging, that was generally around if you're using DC charging, from what I recall, because DC charging, direct current rather than AC current, they were concerned that it might have had an impact on the lifespan of the battery. But I've known people who've been running cars on DC charging, so the kind of motorway ones, for example, with high power, and they have been quite impressed at actually the degradation of those batteries hasn't been as expected. But that was really why they're trying to reduce it down to only 80% charge using the DC charging. And as someone said, you know, battery length of times are surpassing those initial predictions on their lifespan. So electric vehicle charging is generally, cars are generally lasting longer than they thought initially. But of course, it all comes with how do you drive it? How often are you DC charging it? And also issues around, particularly in the winter, that the range decreases because as soon as you start putting electric heating on, as we noted, it has a very high energy demand. And so that will drain quite a lot of power from your battery.
Wow, the longest I ever heard you speak, Cara. Well done. Thank you. Just a point that, rather like Ian, I spent much of my working life in IT, and we certainly developed the expression for people who are looking what to buy. That I said, I can guarantee you that whatever it is that you buy today as a decision will be shown tomorrow to have been the wrong decision. So I think in the same way, things are changing so fast nowadays, despite your forecast that they're not going to change that quickly in the EV market. I think that a lot of startups may come and say, although you, Mr. Conventional legacy car maker who are switching to an electric vehicle and you don't want the technology to change, I think the startups will come ahead and change them anyway, and you'll go for whatever gives you the best bang for the buck. But I guarantee you that if you make a decision today, you'll discover it was the wrong decision tomorrow because something new will be developed. So, Stuart, you've been up again and off again, up again and off again. I'm not quite sure whether you do want to ask a question or not.
I do.
Right.
The hand automatically keeps going down.
Oh, right.
Do all EVs have heat pumps in them for heating?
No, it's conventional for heating inside the cabin. It's just the conventional heater that you would get in any other car, I think. Oh, it's
In a conventional ICE car,
oh, no, it's coming off the engine.
it takes the heat from the engine, doesn't it?
Yeah, no, that's one of the reasons it uses up so much battery power. Yeah.
So it's just electric wires. Yeah.
So if you can see it, I mean, it's absolutely, if you're driving along and you've got all the heat off, yeah, and your range might say 300 miles, if you then put on the air conditioning, which you can preset to a temperature, say 20 degrees or whatever, the range will immediately drop by 40 or 50 miles.
Okay.
And
do modern cars, modern electrics now have bi-directional charging? So you can actually supply the house?
No.
Yes.
Well, but mine doesn't, but some models do.
There are a few. There are a few. I think the Nissan Leaf was the first to lead on it. Even the i3, BMW i3 has got it capable, but hasn't been switched on. And so there's a lot of that kind of technology within the cars, but because we don't have vehicle to grid charging, which does that bi-directional in this country so much, that it hasn't really taken off. But I think we will be seeing more of that happening as batteries in cars will be able to help balance the grid. So while people are parked 90% of the time, whether at work, for example, and plugged in, they'll be able to charge and discharge to help balance the grid and ensure that when they need to go, that will be have a full battery. So it's really exciting to see that kind of element being looked at, particularly around the element of EVs and batteries as part of the grid stabilization.
Yeah, I think National Grid are quite keen to promote that sort of thing.
Yeah, so there are some out there, and I've got friends who have kind of very cleverly looked into the BMW i3, for example, to see that that is part of the hard, I don't know, it's more of electronics, isn't it? The IT hardware of it, but hasn't been activated. But Leafs were leading on that for quite some time. And there's a few vehicle to grid trials, I think, that they've been leading for a while.
And my next question was, how does the 12-volt battery get charged? Does it get charged as you're going along, or only when you're plugged in?
No, when I first got the car, there is somebody else in the village here who already had one, or his wife had one, and he said, "Have you seen the green light yet?" And I said, "What are you talking about?" He said, "Have you seen this green light in your car?" I said, "What green light?" He said, "On the bonnet." And I said, "No, what are you talking about?" "Well, there's a little light on the bonnet that is normally out and you don't notice it. But if that light comes on, the car is charging the 12-volt battery from the main batteries. So it decides when it needs to do that." The problem that I had with the 12-volt battery was the 12-volt battery was kaput. It wasn't accepting any charge. So that's why it went completely flat. But yes, so it doesn't have to be driving along, is the point I'm making. The car will decide on its own when it needs to charge up the 12-volt battery.
Okay, thank you. I'll shut up now.
An interesting comment from Jennifer in the chat about the increased tire wear. So that must make a little bit of difference to your cost of overall cost of owning a car if you've got to change the tires more frequently because the cars are heavier.
I haven't experienced that yet. I don't know whether that's true or not. On conventional cars, because I've driven an awful lot of these over an awful lot of years, it's the driver that seemed to me that was the key factor there, and how heavy your right foot was in terms of tire wear and how you took corners, etc. It could be that electric cars use up more tire tread. I have no experience of that so far.
Out of interest, Ian, what sort of annual mileage are you doing in the electric car?
In this one, 6,000.
Right, so fairly
I
light.
mean, yeah. I mean, when I was working, sometimes I was doing like 20,000 a year in conventional cars.
All right, let me check to see if anyone else has any more questions. I don't see any waving hands or shouts or anything. So thank you.
Sorry, can I just ask one final question?
Of course.
I was wondering about the recycling of the EV batteries. I see Cara put in something about it from Scientific American. But the last I heard was there were 2 recycling plants in Germany and none in the UK.
There's one in France as well. I think Viridor actually own lithium battery recycling. But what's very interesting about the options for EV batteries is that even though they kind of will start to degrade in terms of capacity, they still are very useful for energy storage. So quite a lot of them are then being used for things like backup energy for servers. Some of them being used for renewable energy storage. So they have quite a high second life use before they need to be recycled. And I think the point is in this country is that there isn't that many that have come to end of use completely for it to warrant the expense of setting up a lithium recycling centre. But no doubt as we get to that point, it will be seen as a lucrative business.
Thank you.
It's going to be a lot easier to recycle a pile of batteries to get these elements back out of them again than it is to knock down another mountain or whatever, is my view.
Yeah, quite. Yes, indeed. I mean, they are infinitely recyclable, as is kind of glass and other metals. So it will be seen as a very important resource.
Thanks.
I don't know if you were speaking, Graham, but I think everybody's waiting on you to say something.
I was busy muting myself because of an overflying helicopter.
Oh.
but hopefully we're now back online. So I just wanted to say thank you so much to you, Ian, for the presentation, which was gleeful, I thought. Thank you to all the contributions. Cara, thank you. Good to see you as usual. And with all those thoughts and links that you've got there, thank you very much. Next week, we're going to be talking about climate anxiety from a person who's going to be talking next week and then coming back a month later and giving a different topic, but from the same person. So I recommend that everyone gives that a try. And thank you all for coming. I will put the this session up on the wiki in due course and let you all know when that happens. And in the meantime, have a great rest of the week and see you next time. Goodbye.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.